They were waiting for orders. Hundreds of men. Weapons ready, no one moving, because the order could only come from one person. And that person could not see anything. Not the enemy, not the terrain, not even the men standing beside him. He was completely blind. In most wars, that would have been the end. A blind commander is a liability, a risk, someone to be removed. But this army did the opposite. They reorganized themselves around him. They changed how they fought, how they moved, how they listened, because this was not an army built to react. It was an army built to obey. No sudden charges, no heroic decisions, no improvisation. Only simple commands, repeated again and again, until every man knew exactly what to do, without needing to see. This was not bravery. It was necessity. And it worked. Against knights in heavy armor, against trained cavalry, against enemies who believed they were about to crush a group of peasants. What you are about to see is not the story of a blind man who won battles. It is the story of a war that was forced to change its rules so that a blind man could command it. And once those rules changed, European warfare was never the same again. If this was a normal war, it should have ended almost immediately. Not because one side was braver, not because one side was smarter, but because medieval warfare depended on sight. Commanders watched the field. They looked for movement. They reacted to mistakes. They timed their orders by what they could see. A delay of seconds could decide everything. A blind commander could not do any of that. He could not see a cavalry charge forming. He could not see a flank collapsing. He could not see fear spreading through his own men. And in medieval combat, those moments were fatal. Wars were not won by plans alone. They were won by reacting faster than the other side, which is exactly what a blind man could not do. And that was only the first problem. The second problem was the enemy. Heavy cavalry dominated European battlefields. Armored knights on horseback were not just soldiers, they were weapons. They moved faster than infantry. They hit harder. And when they charged, they did not aim to fight. They aimed to break you. Most armies collapsed before contact. Men ran. Formations shattered. The battle was over in minutes. Against that kind of force, hesitation meant destruction. And this army had every reason to hesitate. They were not professional soldiers. Many of them were farmers, craftsmen, men who had never stood in a real battle line before. They faced opponents trained for war since childhood. Men raised with horses, armor, and weapons. Men who believed this fight would be easy. By every rule of the time, the outcome was obvious. A poorly trained force, led by a commander who could not see, facing the most powerful military system in Europe. No flexibility, no rapid response, no visual control. If this followed the logic of medieval warfare, it should have ended right here. But it didn't. And the reason it didn't was not courage. It was not inspiration. It was not luck. It was because this war stopped following the rules. The man behind this was Žižka. But this story is not about him as a hero. It is about what he built, because he did not try to fight the war as it was. He redesigned it. The first change was space. Medieval battles depended on open ground, flat fields, long sightlines, enough room for cavalry to build speed. Žižka removed that space. Instead of meeting the enemy in the open, his forces created their own terrain. War wagons were chained together, not as vehicles, but as walls. They formed rigid shapes, squares, lines, barriers that could not be easily broken. Inside these formations, infantry could stand without fear of a sudden charge. The battlefield was no longer fluid. It was fixed, and once space was locked, speed stopped mattering. The second change was command. Most medieval armies relied on visual signals, flags, gestures, movements across the field. Žižka could not use any of that, so orders became sound. Short commands, simple words, repeated again and again. Drums, horns, voices. Every man knew exactly what each signal meant, not because he understood the whole battle, but because he had practiced the response. When a sound was heard, there was only one correct action. No interpretation, no hesitation. The system did not require sight. It required obedience. And that led to the third change. The role of the individual disappeared. This army was not built around initiative. It was built around discipline. Soldiers were not encouraged to react. They were trained to execute. Personal judgment was removed. Improvisation was discouraged. Each man became part of a mechanism, a single movement, a single task. If everyone performed their role, the system worked. If someone acted on their own, the system broke. This was not inspiring. It was restrictive, but it solved a problem no other army had solved. A commander who could not see no longer needed to. The battlefield no longer depended on vision. It depended on structure. The enemy could still charge, they could still attack, they could still fight. But they were fighting a battlefield that refused to behave normally. Cavalry could not build momentum. Infantry could not be scattered. Chaos could not spread, because chaos had been engineered out. This is why the system worked. Not because it was clever, not because it was advanced, but because it removed uncertainty. And in war, uncertainty kills faster than steel. But removing chaos came at a price. The system worked, but it was unforgiving. Once the rules were set, there was no room to bend them. Every man had a position. Every movement was assigned. Every response was predefined. That meant safety. But it also meant confinement. Inside the system, there was nowhere to retreat, nowhere to hide, nowhere to improvise. If the order was wrong, you followed it anyway. If the situation changed, you did not adapt. You waited, because the system only worked as long as everyone obeyed. Individual judgment became dangerous. Personal initiative became a threat. A soldier who acted on instinct did not become a hero. He became a problem. Mistakes did not spread as chaos. They spread as damage. And damage was absorbed by the men closest to it. The system protected the formation, not the individual. Those inside it endured exhaustion, hunger, fear. They stood for hours, sometimes days, listening, waiting, repeating the same actions again and again. There was no release, no moment of glory. No recognition, only function. This kind of discipline did not inspire loyalty. It enforced it. Men stayed in place not because they believed, but because leaving would break the structure. And when the structure broke, everyone paid the price. The system demanded obedience, but it offered no mercy. Wounded soldiers were not pulled back easily. Fallen men were replaced without ceremony. The formation closed, and the machine continued. This was not the cost of defeat. It was the cost of survival. The war did not grind these men down because it was chaotic. It ground them down because it was controlled. Because once chaos was removed, nothing remained to soften the pressure. The system did not care who you were. It only cared whether you performed your role. And that was the price of fighting a war that no longer depended on sight. The consequences of this system did not end on that battlefield. Once it worked, it could not be ignored. For centuries, European warfare had revolved around the knight. Speed, shock, individual skill, personal courage. But systems do not respect traditions. They only respond to pressure. What happened here showed that cavalry could be neutralized. That momentum could be blocked. That discipline could outweigh speed. Not everywhere, not immediately, but decisively. Battlefields began to change. Open ground became dangerous. Fixed positions became valuable. Infantry stopped being a temporary solution and became the foundation. Armor grew heavier. Formations grew tighter. Individual heroics mattered less. War began to favor those who could hold position rather than those who could charge. Commanders learnt a new lesson. Victory did not require seeing everything. It required controlling enough. Enough space, enough movement, enough behavior. Once that idea took hold, warfare became less about reacting and more about enforcing structure. The soldier changed as well. He was no longer expected to decide. He was expected to endure. Training replaced instinct. Repetition replaced judgment. Obedience replaced initiative. This did not make war kinder. It made it more efficient. And efficiency has consequences. Wars lasted longer. Armies stayed in the field longer. Pressure became constant instead of sudden. Survival depended less on bravery and more on tolerance. Tolerance for fear, for fatigue, for uncertainty that never fully disappeared. The system did not eliminate chaos. It managed it. And once chaos could be managed, war stopped being exceptional. It became continuous. This was not a single revolution. It was a direction toward war as process, war as structure, war as something that could function even when human limits were reached. That direction would continue with pikes, with firearms, with trenches, with lines that stretched for miles. The names would change, the technologies would evolve, but the idea remained. Control the space, control behavior, and the battle will follow. This was not the end of knights, and it was not the birth of modern war, but it was one of the moments where war stopped asking who was the bravest and started asking which system could endure the longest. Jan Žižka did not invent the future of war, but he helped reveal its direction, not through brilliance, not through vision, but through necessity. He built a way to fight that did not rely on seeing, did not rely on reacting, and did not rely on individuals being exceptional. It worked because it reduced people to what the system required. That was its strength. And its warning. Because once war no longer depends on heroes, it no longer ends with them either. The battlefield becomes quieter, more controlled, more predictable, and more demanding. The soldier is no longer asked to decide. He is asked to endure, to stay in place, to follow structure, to absorb pressure for as long as required. This did not make war modern, and it did not make it humane. It made it sustainable. Long before factories, long before trenches, long before machines, the idea was already there. Control the space, control behavior, and war will continue even when human limits are reached. Jan Žižka did not see the battles he changed, but the systems that followed him made sure sight was no longer necessary. And once that happened, war stopped asking who could see the best. It started asking who could last the longest.